The technology sector is a uniquely brutal landscape. It's an environment that is entirely devoid of sentimentality.
Absolutely, it's a theater of war.
Right, where corporate empires are built overnight and dismantled with equal velocity. And the history of modern consumer electronics is littered with the remnants of organizations that mistakenly believed their momentum was permanent.
Because in this space, momentum is often an illusion.
Exactly. So you are about to witness the forensic autopsy of a corporate titan that defined the modern era, only to be entirely erased from it.
Erased is really the only word for it.
It is. And to conduct this investigation, we're pulling from a vast stack of sources. We've got SEC filings, postmortem supply chain analyses, internal corporate timelines, and retrospective industry reports spanning decades.
A massive amount of data to parse.
Right. We're examining HTC, the high-tech computer corporation, and this narrative arc is staggering in its trajectory.
It really is.
We will trace their origins from a behind-the-scenes manufacturer in 1997, operating entirely in the shadows, to their ascension to the absolute pinnacle of the smartphone revolution in 2011, and finally, to their functional extinction in the mobile space by 2026.
Which is a terrifyingly fast collapse, historically speaking.
Terrifying. So the structure of today's deep dive is strictly chronological and deeply analytical. First, we will investigate the ascent, HTC's unparalleled mastery of hardware engineering and their strategic first-mover advantage.
Advantage that allowed them to briefly corner the global market.
Right, effectively outmaneuvering the largest technology firms on the planet. Then we transition to the unraveling. We will dissect the exact catalyst, the competitive strangulation by the industry duopoly, the marketing failures, and the internal psychological missteps that reduced this giant to dust.
It's a comprehensive breakdown.
It has to be. To establish the clinical reality of this corporate collapse, we must first understand the stakes and the central premise of their failure.
Well, the trajectory of HTC is really the ultimate cautionary tale in modern business history. I mean, it provides definitive empirical proof that pure technological innovation, when isolated from ecosystem control and supreme brand equity, is a fatal vulnerability.
A fatal vulnerability. So you're saying the hardware isn't enough?
It is never enough. You cannot sustain a technology empire on hardware excellence alone. HTC engineered the future, but they failed to construct the moat required to defend it.
The moat.
Exactly. As you examine the data we have compiled today, you will see a company that possessed extraordinary prescience regarding consumer needs, yet they repeatedly failed to understand the macroeconomic forces.
And the psychological warfare, really.
Right, the psychological warfare of brand building that dictate long-term survival. They were architects of the smartphone era who fundamentally misunderstood the economics of the ecosystem they helped build.
That is a chilling thesis. So let's establish the foundation here. We begin our investigation in 1997 in Taiwan.
The very beginning.
HTC was founded by Cher Wang, Peter Chow, and H.T. Chow. And it is vital to note the pedigree here. Cher Wang was the daughter of the late Wang Yongqing.
Right, the chairman of the Taiwanese conglomerate Formosa Plastics Group.
Exactly. So she brought significant industrial backing and capital. But HTC did not begin as a consumer-facing brand.
No, not at all.
They originated as an original design manufacturer, or ODM, and an original equipment manufacturer, an OEM. For the listener, we must clarify these terms. Being an ODM means acting essentially as a technological ghostwriter.
A ghostwriter is a perfect analogy.
Right. A major brand like Dell or Compaq comes to you with a broad concept or even just a brand name, and you design, engineer, and manufacture the device, which is then sold under their name.
You're the invisible engine.
The invisible engine. So when consumers purchased the highly acclaimed Compaq IPQ in 2000 or the O2 XDA and Orange SPV in 2002, they believed they were buying American or European engineering.
When in reality, they were holding pure HTC hardware.
Pure HTC. And HTC possessed early prescience. They bet heavily on the GSM standard.
Which was a massive risk at the time.
Huge risk. It's essentially the cellular communication language that Europe was using. HTC correctly theorized that this standard would eventually cross the Atlantic and dominate the fragmented systems utilized in the United States.
And that bet paid off immensely.
It did. Furthermore, they forged deep early partnerships with Microsoft, building devices for the early Windows CE and Windows Mobile operating systems. Because of this high-level engineering work, they commanded profit margins of roughly 20%.
Which is staggering. I mean, it's far above the industry average of 5% for standard contract manufacturers.
Exactly. Yet, in 2006, HTC made a decisive, highly disruptive shift. They acquired a regional distributor named Dopod and stepped out of the shadows.
They began selling devices under their own proprietary brand.
Right. We must analyze the mechanics of this initial era. What were the unique advantages and, conversely, the inherent structural risks of the ODM model for a company like HTC in the early 2000s?
Well, operating as an ODM for industry giants like Compaq, Dell, and Palm, as well as massive telecommunications carriers like Verizon and Orange, it granted HTC an unparalleled, highly subsidized education in mobile engineering.
Subsidized education.
Exactly. I mean, when you build devices to the exact rigorous specifications of diverse global clients, you are essentially being paid by those clients to master global supply chain logistics.
And component sourcing, rapid product iteration.
Right, you're learning on someone else's dime. The Compaq IPQ is the prime illustrative example from our research stack. In the year 2000, creating a pocket-sized personal computer with a high-resolution color display that did not immediately drain its battery was an immense engineering hurdle.
It was nearly impossible at the time.
Right. Heat dissipation and power management in a miniaturized chassis were unsolved problems, and HTC solved that thermal and power management puzzle.
They solved it.
They did. By executing these complex contracts, HTC built a formidable research and development apparatus without carrying the financial burden of marketing, or inventory risk, or consumer brand management.
Because if a Compaq device failed to sell, Compaq absorbed the retail loss.
Exactly. HTC had already been paid for the manufacturing, so they became the undisputed masters of miniaturization and hardware integration long before the global public ever learned their name.
But there's a flip side to that safety, isn't there?
There is. The critical risk of the ODM model is anonymity and expendability. Because you do not own the customer relationship, you have zero brand loyalty. You are perpetually vulnerable to your client simply finding a cheaper assembly partner in Shenzhen, China, next quarter.
Right, you're always one contract away from losing your revenue stream. But this specific transition in 2006 demands intense scrutiny. By abandoning the safety of white label manufacturing to launch their own brand, didn't HTC effectively declare war on the very clients that built their fortune?
That is exactly what they did.
Because as I review this timeline, it appears they transformed almost overnight from an indispensable, quiet partner into a direct, highly capable competitor.
A very dangerous competitor.
Right. They were suddenly placing their own devices on the same retail shelves as the companies that had been funding their research and development for nearly a decade.
It was an act of corporate insurgency, really. When HTC acquired Dopod and began printing the HTC logo on the casing of their devices, they fundamentally severed the trust inherent in the ODM client relationship.
Burn the bridge.
They did. Telecommunications carriers and software partners suddenly viewed HTC with deep structural suspicion. I mean, if you are Microsoft, or if you are T-Mobile, you must immediately ask yourself, is HTC reserving their most advanced hardware innovations for their own branded devices and giving us second-tier engineering?
Which is a completely logical fear.
Entirely logical. But HTC wagered that their technological superiority was so absolute, so far ahead of the competition, that carriers would be forced to stock their branded phones regardless of the friction it caused.
That is an immense existential gamble.
It was. They were trading a guaranteed, safe 20% margin in the shadows for the infinite, but highly volatile potential of the consumer spotlight. They were betting that the hardware itself would be the defining factor of success in the coming decade.
And that gamble accelerated into historical significance in 2008. The launch of their own brand set the stage for what we will examine next: the vanguard of the Android operating system and the zenith of HTC's global power, spanning roughly from 2008 to 2011.
This is their golden era.
It is. In 2008, HTC launched the HTC Dream.
Known in the United States as the T-Mobile G1.
Right, the G1. This was the world's first commercial Android smartphone, and if you think back to that era, this device was entirely unique.
It was a very strange piece of hardware.
It really was. It featured a 3.2-inch display, a slide-out physical keyboard, a pronounced physical chin at the bottom, and a mechanical trackball for navigation.
Which seems archaic now, but at the time...
At the time, it was revolutionary. It was a direct, calculated response to the 2007 launch of the Apple iPhone. And what followed this initial launch was a rapid, almost relentless succession of milestones that dictated the trajectory of the entire telecommunications industry.
They just didn't stop releasing hits.
They didn't. The HTC Hero introduced the highly acclaimed HTC Sense user interface.
A critical software development.
Right. Then the HTC Evo 4G became the first 4G-capable phone in the United States.
Breaking network barriers.
Exactly. The Thunderbolt and Titan II became the world's first LTE, Android, and Windows phones, respectively. This product pipeline culminated in HTC's financial zenith in 2011.
And the fiscal data from this specific window is staggering.
It is. Let's lay out the numbers. HTC captured 10.7% of the global smartphone market. Yeah. In the third quarter of 2011, they achieved the unthinkable. They became the #1 smartphone vendor in the United States with a 24% market share.
Shipping 5.7 million units in that quarter alone.
Unbelievable. They briefly beat both Apple, which held 20%, and Samsung, which held 21%. Their market valuation peaked at approximately $33 billion.
$43 billion.
Right. They shipped over 40 million devices globally and ranked number 98 on Interbrand's top global brands list, carrying an estimated brand value of $3.6 billion. We must dissect this specific window of dominance. How did HTC capitalize so effectively on Google's strategic requirements at that exact historical moment?
Well, to understand HTC's zenith, you really must understand the state of absolute panic within Google following the launch of the Apple iPhone in 2007.
Panic is the right word.
It was total panic. Google's core business was, and of course remains, search and advertising. Google realized immediately that if Apple controlled the hardware and the proprietary operating system of the mobile future, Google's search monopoly would be severely threatened.
Because Apple could just default users to Yahoo?
Exactly. Or build their own search engine, and Google would be locked out of the mobile internet entirely. So Google desperately needed a hardware champion to push their newly acquired open-source Android operating system out to the masses to ensure Google search remained ubiquitous.
And HTC was the perfect weapon for that.
The perfect instrument for this offensive. HTC, with its unmatched agility and deep engineering talent honed during its ODM years, could design, prototype, and manufacture the HTC Dream in a fraction of the time it would take a bloated legacy manufacturer like Nokia or Motorola to even hold a board meeting.
The speed advantage was monumental.
It was. But the hardware was only half the equation. We must look at the software layer. Early Android, as delivered by Google, was highly unrefined.
I remember it. It was brutal.
It was. From a consumer usability standpoint, it was a clunky utilitarian operating system originally designed to compete with BlackBerry, not the iPhone. It lacked polish. It lacked fluidity.
Right.
This is where HTC Sense UI became HTC's most valuable and ultimately defining asset.
I want to focus deeply on that specific element. Because for anyone who remembers the smartphone landscape of 2011, HTC Sense was inescapable.
It was everywhere.
Right. If you or a colleague purchased an Android device, you likely remember a massive, beautifully rendered digital flip clock widget on the home screen. That was HTC.
That widget is iconic.
It is. Can you explain the actual mechanism of what Sense UI was? We often read in these reports that it masked Google's code, but how did it function structurally?
Well, think of Google's early Android operating system as the concrete foundation and the rough plumbing of a house.
Okay.
Google gave this foundation away for free to any manufacturer willing to pour it. However, the house itself was entirely unfurnished and visually austere.
Bare bones.
Right. HTC came in and built a custom, highly luxurious mansion directly on top of that foundation. That mansion was the Sense UI. Structurally, it was a software layer running concurrently over the base Android code. HTC injected visual polish that base Android simply lacked.
What kind of polish specifically?
They added momentum-based scrolling, pinch-to-zoom capabilities, and high-resolution weather animations, like a virtual windshield wiper actually clearing rain off your screen.
Which was mind-blowing in 2009.
It was. More importantly, they integrated APIs for Facebook and Twitter directly into the phone's native contact book long before Google offered that functionality.
So it unified your contacts.
Seamlessly. When you opened the contact, you saw their recent social media updates right there. HTC Sense made Android acceptable to the mass market. It smoothed the harsh edges of Google's code and defined the premium Android experience of that era.
So they weren't buying Android, really?
No. When consumers bought those early devices, they were not buying them for Android. They were buying them for the HTC Sense experience.
Yet looking at the macroeconomic data, a critical anomaly emerges here. How does a Taiwanese company with absolutely zero consumer legacy, a company that was essentially a ghost in the industry just 5 years prior, outmaneuver both Apple and Samsung in the United States, capturing nearly a quarter of the most lucrative technology market on Earth.
It seems impossible on paper.
It does. I mean, Apple had Steve Jobs, an immense cultural cachet. Samsung was a massive conglomerate with endless resources. How did HTC beat them both in Q3 of 2011?
It was a masterclass in aggressive speed to market and the ruthless exploitation of United States carrier dynamics. You really have to recall Apple's initial distribution strategy in the US.
The exclusivity deal.
Exactly. The original iPhone and its immediate successors were locked into an exclusive multi-year contract with AT&T. This strategic choice by Apple created an immense vacuum.
Because the other carriers were starting?
Right. It left the other major carriers, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile, desperate for a premium touchscreen device that could compete with the iPhone and prevent their subscriber bases from fleeing to AT&T.
And Samsung wasn't ready to fill that void.
Not yet. Samsung at this time was still struggling to find its identity in the smartphone space. They were producing disjointed, heavily fragmented product lines that lacked a cohesive brand. HTC recognized this immense vacuum and moved with breathtaking speed.
So they became the supplier for everyone else.
Right. They leveraged the deep relationships they had built during their ODM days to provide Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile with exactly what they needed: highly advanced, exclusive flagship devices tailored to their specific network rollouts.
Custom weapons for each carrier.
Exactly. When Sprint needed a device to market their new 4G WiMAX network, HTC delivered the Evo 4G, giving Sprint a massive marketing advantage. When Verizon needed a flagship to launch their new 4G LTE network, HTC engineered the Thunderbolt.
So HTC was functioning as the premier, highly agile arms dealer for the U.S. telecommunications carriers in their war against AT&T's iPhone exclusivity.
Arms dealer is a perfect term. Their speed of iteration, moving from prototype to retail shelf, was simply unmatched by any other manufacturer on the planet.
But the very velocity that propelled them to the summit could not be sustained. The industry was fundamentally shifting beneath them.
The landscape was changing rapidly.
It was. The vacuum they exploited was closing. The carriers no longer needed an arms dealer because the landscape was solidifying into established powers. The transition from Q3 2011 onward is stark. Between 2012 and 2014, the architecture of the mobile industry underwent a seismic consolidation.
A total paradigm shift.
Apple and Samsung began to execute a ruthless, highly capitalized duopoly that would fundamentally strangle the market. Concurrently, a new wave of highly aggressive Chinese original equipment manufacturers companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and ZTE emerged, capturing the low-end market with brutal pricing efficiency.
Which left HTC with nowhere to maneuver.
Right. HTC found itself paralyzed. Our sources indicate a fatal pricing misstep in emerging markets, specifically China and India. The data shows that HTC leadership categorically refused to price phones below 1,000 Chinese yuan.
Which was a catastrophic error.
It was. At that time, this meant their absolute cheapest devices were costing around 2,000 yuan, which translates to roughly $315. By rigidly holding this pricing floor to protect their perceived premium brand image, they completely priced themselves out of a booming demographic that was instantly absorbed by Xiaomi and Huawei.
They handed that market over completely.
They did. Furthermore, this period is defined by the devastation of the patent wars. In March 2010, Apple launched a massive, multi-front legal offensive,
filing a lawsuit against HTC in the U.S. District Court and the International Trade Commission, the ITC.
Right. And the catastrophic blow landed in 2012 when U.S. Customs, acting on an ITC exclusion order, physically blocked shipments of HTC's new flagship devices, the One X and the Evo 4G LTE, at the United States border.
This is the precise moment the structural integrity of HTC's business model fractured. HTC was caught in a classic economic trap, what analysts term the squeeze in the middle.
The squeeze in the middle. Let's analyze that. Let's look at the upper end of the market first.
Okay, so Apple was perfecting its proprietary closed ecosystem, integrating iMessage, the App Store, and iCloud. This created a profound psychological and digital lock-in.
Right, because once you're in, it's painful to leave.
Exactly. Once a consumer invested in iOS, the friction required to leave that ecosystem became immense. Samsung, meanwhile, leveraged its massive diversified conglomerate scale. We must explain what vertical integration means in this context.
It means they own the parts.
They own everything. Samsung manufactures its own high-resolution displays, its own memory chips, and its own silicon processors. Because they owned the supply chain, Samsung could operate on thinner margins and flood every single price tier globally with a relentless wave of Galaxy devices.
Backed by a multi-billion-dollar marketing budget.
Right. HTC lacked the premium cult-like brand equity of Apple to command total loyalty, and they completely lacked the manufacturing scale and component cost advantages of Samsung to compete on sheer volume.
They were just buying parts.
Right, they were buying screens and processors at market rates, while Samsung was buying them internally at cost.
And what about the bottom of the market? The pricing strategy in China seems, in retrospect, astonishingly stubborn.
At the bottom of the market, HTC's refusal to compete on price in China was a catastrophic miscalculation of global demographics.
They just wouldn't budge.
No. Cher Wang and Peter Chow believed the HTC brand was strong enough to command a premium in Shanghai and Mumbai, just as it had in New York and London. They were fundamentally wrong.
Because Xiaomi was playing a completely different game.
A totally different game. Companies like Xiaomi were operating on a razor-thin, near-zero profit margin on hardware, monetizing the software and services instead. Xiaomi offered 90% of HTC's hardware functionality for 50% of the price.
Wow.
Because HTC refused to lower their prices to roughly $150, they were effectively evicted from the fastest-growing technology markets on Earth. They surrendered billions of future consumers to Chinese competitors who used that volume to build their own massive war chests.
We must analyze the specific mechanics of Apple's patent litigation, because it is crucial to understanding how the supply chain was disrupted. I want to pose a theory based on our analysis of the timeline.
Right.
Was Apple's legal campaign against HTC a genuine, principled defense of intellectual property, or was it a weaponized legal siege? Was it a calculated strategy designed specifically to choke the logistics of their most agile competitor at the exact moment HTC was dominating the U.S. market?
Well, forensic analysis of corporate litigation in the tech sector clearly indicates it was a weaponized siege.
The timeline is just too perfect.
The timeline is not coincidental. Apple's leadership, specifically Steve Jobs, was famously enraged by the Android platform, viewing it as a stolen product that copied the iPhone's core innovations.
Yeah.
However, suing Google directly was a protracted, complex endeavor with highly uncertain outcomes, given Google's immense resources. So HTC was the ideal proxy target.
Proxy war.
Exactly. They were the most successful Android manufacturer at the time, generating the most revenue from the platform. But they lacked the vast internal legal resources and the massive defensive patent portfolios of a legacy conglomerate like Samsung or Motorola. Apple utilized the International Trade Commission not merely to extract financial licensing fees, but to physically disrupt HTC's logistics.
So how does an ITC exclusion order actually work in practice? What does that mean for a company moving hardware across the Pacific?
An ITC exclusion order is a nuclear option in trade disputes. It directs U.S. Customs and Border Protection to halt the importation of infringing goods.
Meaning physical confiscation.
Yes. In the smartphone industry, the product life cycle is agonizingly short. A flagship phone generates the vast majority of its revenue and cultural impact in the first 90 days after launch.
That launch window is everything.
It is everything. When U.S. Customs halted the shipments of the HTC One X and Evo 4G LTE at the border in 2012, they physically impounded warehouses full of inventory. It created a devastating, unrecoverable delay.
The carriers must have been furious.
They were. Telecommunications carriers, who had spent millions preparing for launch, were suddenly left without inventory. HTC's marketing campaigns were burning cash on television and print ads with no product on shelves to sell.
And the consumer?
Well, a consumer walking into a retail store to buy a new phone is rarely willing to wait 3 weeks for a customs dispute to clear.
No, they want a phone today.
Right. They simply walked across the aisle and purchased a Samsung Galaxy S3 instead. That litigation drained billions in potential revenue, diverted immense executive focus from engineering to legal defense, and, as industry analysts have accurately stated, it ruined HTC's constitution.
Ruined their constitution.
They never fully recovered their momentum or their relationships with U.S. carriers after that catastrophic border blockade.
And the vacuum created by that border blockade allowed Samsung to flood the market, which exposed severe internal strategic flaws within HTC. This leads us into our next phase of analysis, the marketing failures and identity collapse from 2011 to 2015.
This is where the internal chaos really becomes public.
It does. While Samsung was executing a highly disciplined, singular franchise-building strategy around the Galaxy brand, HTC descended into product strategy chaos. Between 2009 and 2011, HTC flooded the global market with over 100 confusingly named phones.
100. It's an absurd number.
It is. Consumers were faced with an overwhelming wall of monikers. You had the HTC sensation, the Desire, the Incredible, the Cha-Cha, the Salsa, the Velocity.
A total mess.
Right. And they further damaged their reach through severe, inexplicable carrier exclusivity errors. For example, they restricted the highly reviewed and anticipated HTC One X exclusively to the AT&T network in the United States, and years later restricted the U11 solely to Sprint.
Which artificially and voluntarily shrank their addressable audience.
Voluntarily shrank it. But the absolute pinnacle of their marketing collapse occurred in 2013 with a $1 billion global marketing campaign titled Here's to Change.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. This campaign featured actor Robert Downey Jr. and utilized abstract, surrealist acronyms for HTC. Most notably, huge tinfoil catamaran and hipster troll car wash.
It's almost hard to believe.
It is. This incomprehensible strategy stood in stark, damaging contrast to their earlier, highly effective and modest, quietly brilliant tagline.
The forensic breakdown of HTC's marketing strategy during this period reveals a profound systemic failure to understand the psychology of consumer branding, particularly in an era of technological commoditization.
Right, because the hardware was leveling out.
Exactly. When you analyze the industry, Titans, Apple, and Samsung, you see absolute, unwavering franchise discipline. A consumer does not say they are going to buy an Apple smartphone. They say they're going to buy an iPhone.
Or they say they're buying a Galaxy.
Right. The product itself, the specific lineage, is the franchise. HTC failed entirely to build a durable product franchise. By flooding the market with 100 different completely unrelated names, Salsa, Cha-Cha, Velocity, Sensation, they actively diluted their own brand equity.
They confuse the customer.
They created massive cognitive overload for the average consumer. When a customer walked into a retail store, there was no clear hierarchy, no clear flagship lineage to follow from year to year. You didn't know if the Incredible was superior to the Desire.
There was no logical progression.
None. And the carrier exclusivity deals heavily compounded this error. By locking the One X to AT&T, they voluntarily surrendered tens of millions of potential willing customers who were locked into contracts on Verizon and T-Mobile.
It's corporate self-sabotage.
It is. In an era where Samsung was aggressively ensuring the Galaxy S3 was available on every single carrier globally, simultaneously, HTC's exclusivity strategy was tantamount to corporate self-sabotage. They were limiting their own volume precisely when scale was becoming the only metric that mattered.
The Robert Downey Jr. campaign requires specific clinical dissection because the financial scale of the error is staggering. A $1 billion expenditure. That is a massive percentage of their operating capital at the time, centered around phrases like huge tinfoil catamaran.
It was a monumental waste of capital.
We have to look at the macroeconomic context here. At this exact historical moment, in 2013, Samsung was spending billions on highly targeted, aggressive attack advertisements.
Directly going after Apple.
Right. They were mocking Apple users waiting in line, positioning the Galaxy as the technologically superior, larger-screened alternative. Samsung's ads were direct, comparative, and feature-focused. So how does a board of directors looking at hemorrhaging market share approve a billion-dollar budget for abstract, surrealist humor?
It was a manifestation of pure corporate panic. HTC leadership recognized that their modest, quietly brilliant ethos was no longer sufficient in a market dominated by Samsung's deafening, multi-billion-dollar roar.
They felt they were being drowned out.
They did. They felt they needed to make noise. However, instead of articulating a clear, compelling value proposition, instead of clearly explaining to the consumer why an HTC device was functionally superior, they attempted to buy cultural relevance through sheer celebrity spectacle.
But it was too abstract.
Right. The Here's to Change campaign failed because it was fundamentally arrogant. It assumed the modern consumer was willing to spend their time deciphering inside jokes and surrealist humor just to understand what the product was.
Which they weren't.
No. In reality, by 2013, the smartphone had evolved from a novelty into an essential utilitarian tool. Consumers wanted to know about battery life, camera and sensor quality, and screen resolution.
The practical metrics.
Exactly. Samsung's marketing, while aggressive, clearly communicated the features of the Galaxy series. HTC spent $1 billion to intentionally confuse the public. It generated zero brand loyalty, failed to move existing inventory, and failed to explain why anyone should abandon the Apple or Samsung ecosystems.
It's just a tragic misuse of funds.
It stands as one of the most inefficient, catastrophic allocations of marketing capital in modern corporate history.
And this recurring theme of misallocation brings us to the next critical phase of their unraveling: Misallocated capital, hardware gimmicks, and toxic corporate culture, dominating the period of 2013 to 2017.
The desperation really sets in here.
It does. Desperate to differentiate themselves as their initial hardware advantage eroded against Samsung's scale, HTC initiated a series of external acquisitions that yielded disastrous financial returns.
Just burning through their reserves.
Right. They spent $48 million on a video delivery platform called Saffron Digital, $40 million on a cloud gaming service named OnLive, $18 million on a sync service called Dashwire, and executed a massive $300 million stake in Beats Audio.
And none of those paid off structurally.
None of them. None of these acquisitions created a defensible moat against Apple or Samsung. Concurrently, HTC's hardware strategy pivoted toward what many analysts describe as gimmicks.
Gimmicks is a harsh term, but accurate.
They introduced the ultra-pixel camera, stereoscopic 3D cameras on the Evo 3D, and EdgeSense, which is a feature that allowed users to physically squeeze the chassis of the U11 phone to trigger actions like taking a photo.
The squeezable phone.
Right. Eventually, they even launched the Exodus One, a blockchain-focused smartphone. Behind these strategic and product failures lay profound internal turmoil. The corporate culture grew increasingly rigid and fearful.
The leadership started to crack.
CEO Peter Chow issued a highly public ultimatum to his executives, stating unequivocally that he would resign if the HTC One flagship failed to turn the company around. Anonymous reports from Glassdoor during this period painted a grim picture of a culture dominated by fear and intimidation.
A total lack of trust.
A complete lack of trust between the central headquarters in Taiwan and regional offices worldwide, and intense internal secrecy. This toxic environment ultimately forced the return of co-founder Sher Wang as CEO in 2015.
The clinical analysis of this specific period shows a company thrashing in deep water, desperately grasping for a lifeline without a cohesive strategy. Let us examine the acquisitions first, because they highlight a fundamental misunderstanding of ecosystem economics. Well, HTC believed that by purchasing disparate content in cloud platforms like OnLive and Saffron Digital, they could rapidly build an ecosystem to rival Apple's iTunes or iCloud. But an ecosystem is not a collection of apps. It requires massive, sustained, integrated investment and hundreds of millions of locked-in users to attract developers.
You can't just buy it off the shelf.
No, spending $100 million on random tech startups does not buy you an ecosystem. It merely drains your critical cash reserves when you need them most for hardware R&D.
And what about the Beats Audio deal, $300 million?
The Beats Audio acquisition was equally flawed in its execution. While it temporarily boosted the audio credentials of their devices, giving them a recognizable logo on the back of the phone, consumers do not choose a primary computing device based solely on a branded equalizer profile.
It didn't change the buying decision.
It did not create lock-in. Apple eventually bought Beats entirely, integrating it deeply into their hardware and software fabric to launch Apple Music. HTC simply rented the brand name, slapped a logo on the back of their phones, and eventually sold the stake back at a loss.
But I must push back on the characterization of their hardware choices during this era. Is it entirely fair or accurate to dismiss these features as mere gimmicks?
Well, let's look at them technically.
Right, let's look at the mechanisms. The ultra-pixel camera was an attempt to prioritize light capture and pixel size over raw megapixel count, which is exactly how modern smartphone cameras operate today. EdgeSense was a novel physical interface utilizing pressure sensors along the aluminum frame.
Both required impressive engineering.
Exactly. Weren't these genuine forward-thinking innovations that were simply starved of oxygen because HTC did not own the underlying Android operating system to deeply integrate and support them long-term?
That is the crucial distinction, and you have identified the exact mechanism of HTC's structural vulnerability. The engineering behind the ultra-pixel sensor, or the pressure sensors required for EdgeSense, was undeniably impressive from a purely technical standpoint.
Yeah.
But innovation without deep ecosystem integration is ephemeral. Let's revisit the mansion metaphor. HTC was still building beautiful additions onto a house that sat on rented land.
Rented land, Google's land.
Exactly. When Apple introduces a hardware feature like Face ID, they weave it into the absolute core of the iOS operating system. They integrate it into Apple Pay, into native password management, into third-party banking apps. It becomes an indispensable pillar of the user experience.
It becomes locked in.
Right. Because HTC did not control the core Android code Google did. They could only build these features as superficial layers on top. A consumer might find a squeezable phone mildly amusing or convenient for a week, but it's not create the psychological and functional lock-in of an integrated service like iMessage.
It doesn't keep them from leaving.
No, it does not prevent that consumer from buying a Samsung the following year. Hardware features can be easily reverse engineered by competitors or rendered obsolete by Google's native software updates. Without owning the software ecosystem, HTC's innovations were highly expensive parlor tricks that generated zero long-term customer retention.
And it is clear from the data that this failure to retain customers bred the toxic culture we noted.
Exactly. When a company is built on engineering triumph, and suddenly that engineering fails to move the needle on sales, panic sets in. When R&D budgets are slashed due to falling revenue, and executives are operating under highly public ultimatums from their CEO, the culture fundamentally shifts.
It becomes about self-preservation.
Right. Innovation requires a tolerance for failure. When Peter Chow declared he would resign if the HTC One failed, he tied the entire company's survival to a single product cycle. A culture of fear and intimidation destroys the creative risk-taking that built HTC in the first place.
Everyone freezes.
Engineers stop proposing radical ideas and start focusing on protecting their jobs. The internal secrecy you mentioned between headquarters and regional offices means marketing is disconnected from engineering. The return of Cher Wang in 2015 was less a strategic masterstroke and more a desperate, necessary stabilization effort to prevent a total executive collapse.
And that collapse, unfortunately, could not be contained, leading to our final grim chapter, the financial devastation, the Google bailout, and the dust, covering the timeline from 2015 to 2026.
The final descent.
The financial freefall during this period is starkly documented in SEC filings and market reports. In the third quarter of 2013, HTC posted its first-ever net loss of 3 billion new Taiwan dollars, roughly 100 million USD. By August of 2015, HTC's stock had plummeted 60%.
A total market rejection.
Right. This pushed its total market value below its cash on hand, which was 47.2 billion new Taiwan dollars, or approximately 1.5 billion USD. We must pause on this fact. In the cold, objective calculus of Wall Street, the market viewed the HTC brand, its massive manufacturing factories, its global patents, and its entire corporate legacy as functionally worthless.
Worthless. It's a staggering reality.
They were trading at a negative enterprise value. Investors believed the company was worth more dead and liquidated than alive and operating. The financial bleeding continued unabated until the operating margin hit a catastrophic negative 60.8% in the fourth quarter of 2017.
Resulting in an operating loss of 9.6 billion new Taiwan dollars.
Over 300 million USD in a single quarter. This absolute financial devastation forced the January 2018 Google deal.
The bailout.
Google purchased 2,000 of HTC's top research and development engineers, the exact team responsible for building Google's own Pixel phones under a modern ODM agreement, along with non-exclusive intellectual property rights, for $1.1 billion in cash.
The death knell.
This transaction was the definitive death knell for HTC's smartphone ambitions. The company subsequently pivoted heavily toward virtual reality, launching the HTC Vive and capturing a 13.3% market share in 2019, trailing behind Sony and Oculus.
A pivot born of necessity.
Right. But this pivot brings us to the chilling empirical reality of 2026. Today, HTC's global smartphone market share sits at a functional 0%. Legacy devices, such as the U24 Pro, are only found liquidated in regional Middle Eastern and North African markets.
They are essentially ghosts.
They are entirely devoid of operating system updates, stuck on Android 13, entirely lacking modern carrier support, and effectively abandoned by their creator.
We must conduct a rigorous, unsentimental postmortem on that $1.1 billion Google transaction. In the media at the time, it was often framed as a partnership.
Right, they spun it as a collaboration.
But was it a strategic acquisition? Or was it a corporate mercy killing? The financial and operational data heavily supports the latter. Google did not buy HTC. They did not buy the massive manufacturing facilities in Taiwan. They did not buy the supply chain contracts. And they certainly did not buy the HTC consumer brand name.
So what were they buying?
They executed a precision extraction of human capital. They bought the 2,000 engineers who actually knew how to design and build premium hardware, effectively absorbing the only asset HTC had left of any true, durable value.
It was an acqui-hire.
It was an acqui-hire of unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
For HTC, the $1.1 billion was a momentary injection of liquidity. It was an oxygen tank that allowed them to avoid immediate bankruptcy proceedings and fund their expensive transition into virtual reality. but it officially severed their central nervous system in the mobile space.
They sold their brain trust.
Exactly. The transition to the HTC Vive was a necessary survival tactic, moving into a nascent, less crowded market where they could once again leverage their hardware expertise. However, VR remains a niche enterprise and gaming sector compared to the ubiquitous trillion-dollar global smartphone market. HTC survived the decade, but they survived by accepting permanent irrelevance in the very industry they helped create.
If you attempt to interface with the HTC mobile ecosystem today, in 2026, you are met with a digital wasteland. If you search for an HTC phone online, you are engaging with dead stock.
Just warehouse remnants.
You will find devices sold without manufacturer warranties, running obsolete security patches that are flagged by modern banking applications as actively vulnerable. The lithium-ion batteries in these final unsold units have chemically degraded on warehouse shelves.
The physical decay matching the corporate decay.
The empire is officially and irrevocably dust. HTC was the primary architect of the modern smartphone era. They laid the physical foundation for Android's global dominance, teaching the world, and specifically Google, how to build a premium touchscreen device that could rival Apple.
And yet,
Yet they were ultimately evicted from the very house they built, outspent by conglomerates with vertical supply chains, and outmaneuvered by software giants who controlled the operating code.
their legacy is a permanent, glaring warning etched into the ledger of the technology sector. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that possessing the best engineering talent, achieving the fastest time to market, and perfectly predicting consumer hardware trends is entirely insufficient for long-term survival.
It's just not enough.
You must build a defensible moat. You must own the ecosystem, or you must own the supply chain. HTC owned neither.
And it leaves you, the observer of this corporate autopsy, with a chilling reality to consider regarding the devices you rely on today. In the modern tech landscape, making the best product is no longer enough. If you do not control the software ecosystem, if you do not own the digital environment where your users live, you are merely building a kingdom on someone else's land. And as HTC learned with devastating finality, when the landlord decides to expand, you will be reduced to dust.